All right, all you fun lovers and thrill seekers, welcome back to the Hoplite channel. And if you read the title, you are here to see the fourth and final part for Karl von Clausewitz on war. Yes, this will be the conclusion to the four-part series I'm doing on Commander von Clausewitz and his fantastic work on war. If you are coming to the channel after watching parts 1, 2, and 3, that's awesome. You're troopers. I really appreciate it. If I could give you a medal, a gold star, I would pin it on your chest right now and give you a salute, as I said in the last segment. But yeah, this will be the fourth part, and I'm just going to motor through some bullet points I wrote down here for Mr. von Clausewitz's legacy. And then we'll talk about some readings, and you will have the go-bys as always. Right, so we wrapped up part 3, and I discussed the French Revolutionary Wars being the cauldron in which Karl von Clausewitz was brewed, and in which his work on war was essentially forged. Right, so after his death, the publication, and enough people had read on war, what are the main takeaways? What's the main legacy of this work? Well, as we know from part 1, von Clausewitz said that war is essentially the overthrow of one's enemy. However, the overthrow of your enemy has a multitude of forms and is rarely final. And this was pretty revolutionary thinking for someone in this field, because it was always understood prior to von Clausewitz's day and age that the overthrow of your enemy was simply the destruction of their forces and the occupation of their territories. But von Clausewitz said that this could be one or two types of overthrow, but the overthrow was not necessarily definitive in its form. It could be economic overthrow, it could be political overthrow, it could just be a psychological overthrow of your enemy, or it could be the overthrow of your enemy's stronger allies, leaving them isolated and defenseless. So the overthrow was more or less a catch-all term for what von Clausewitz determined a victory. So a war should equal the overthrow of your enemy. That's the object, right? So war equals this objective, and the objective has a multitude of forms, and it's rarely final. So as he said in part 1, war is sometimes merely a transitory evil. So war should never be understood as the conclusion to any country or any people's history. It's merely a bullet point, as you see here, or a footnote in the tapestry that will be that people's legacy, unless they're completely annihilated, which has occurred in history, but it's extremely rare. So war equals the overthrow. The overthrow must have a multitude of forms, because we see throughout history that the conclusion of many different wars had many different outcomes, and the outcomes were not just merely the destruction of an opponent's forces, but could be the destruction or occupation of many different things, and it was rarely final. As such, the other legacy we learn from von Clausewitz is his condensation of war into a trinity, which is kind of odd that we speak of war as a trinity, like the Holy Trinity, but this was his trinity. And he came up with these 3 prongs of war that he felt defined it. And that would be the enmity between the people that are fighting, right? So you could have like the enmity between Sparta and Athens, which in that day and age was visceral. It was a very deep-seated enmity between the two countries at some periods. And then you could have wars between countries that kind of don't last the test of time. Like, for example, the United States and Great Britain, right? There was significant enmity during America's Revolutionary War, but in the years after, that enmity waned, and we became allies by this First World War. So within 100 years, give or take, the enmity had ebbed and flowed, and that's one of the Trinity parts of the Trinity, is what determines the conflict is the enmity between the people and the probability. And this was what he determined to be the fog of war, which would essentially be what chances do your forces have against your opponents, what different types of probability will determine victory or defeat. And then lastly, the policy. What is the policy of our country in this war? Is it stagnant? Is it fluid? And does the policy take into account the first two prongs of the Trinity, which is how badly does our people need to win this war? How much do we hate our enemy? And what are our chances? And that the policy should be dictated by these two, and that the policy should always change in reflection of these two as well. So this was the Trinity. And lastly, this was, we'll see in the readings here, von Clausewitz makes this case, but you could say that it's not necessarily a quote from him, but a lot of people attribute the philosophy to von Clausewitz that the best offense is a good defense, so said Karl. Right, so we'll look in the readings coming up here that von Clausewitz always regarded that the defensive strategy of a war should be to go back on the offensive, and that the offensive strategy of a war should always be looking to take something from your enemy that you can later defend. And the purposes of that defense is so that you can later parlay it into offense. So his idea of a good offense was essentially a better defense. Some people would dispute that and say, well, no, a good defense is a better offense. So your offense should always be the superior strategy. Karl would disagree, perhaps. But he's not here to defend that point. All we have are his writings. Speaking of which, let's get to that right now. All right, here we go. Karl von Clausewitz on War, Part 4, the conclusion. And we jump to the section, the suspension of action in war. Von Clausewitz wrote. This is going to be a longer one, so settle in for this. 154. War often is nothing more than armed neutrality, a threatening attitude meant to support negotiations, a mild attempt to gain some small advantage before sitting back and letting matters take their course, or a disagreeable obligation imposed by an alliance to be discharged with as little effort as possible. In all such cases, where the impetus of interest is slight and where there is little hostile spirit, where we neither want to do much harm to the enemy nor have much to fear from him, in short, where no great motive promotes the action, governments will not want to risk much. This explains the tame conduct of such conflicts in which the hostile spirit of true war is held in check. The more these factors turn war into something half-hearted, the less solid are the bases that are available to theory. Essentials become rare and accidents multiply. Nevertheless, even this type of conflict gives scope to intelligence, possibly even wider and more varied scope. Gambling for high stakes seems to have turned into haggling for small change. In this type of war, where military action is reduced to insignificant time-killing flourishes, to skirmishes that are half in earnest and half in jest, to lengthy orders that add up to nothing, to positions and marches that in retrospect are described as scientific, simply because their minute original motive has been forgotten and common sense cannot make anything of them. In this type of conflict, many theorists see the real, authentic art of war. In these feints, parries, and short lunges of earlier wars, they find the true end of all theory and the triumph of mind over matter. More recent wars appear to them as crude brawls that teach nothing and are to be considered relapses into barbarism. This view is as petty as its subject. In the absence of great forces and passions, it is indeed simpler for ingenuity to function. But in not guiding great forces, navigation through storms and surging waves, a higher exercise of the intellect. That other, formalized type of swordsmanship is surely included and implicit in the more energetic mode of conducting war. It has the same relation to it as the movements to a ship have to the motion of the ship. It can only be carried on so long as it is tacitly understood that the opponent follows suit. But is it possible to tell how long this condition will be observed? The French Revolution surprised us in the false security of our ancient skills and drove us from Chalon to Moscow. With equal suddenness, Frederick the Great surprised the Austrians in the quiet of their antiquated ways of war, and shook their monarchy to its foundations. Woe to the government which, relying on half-hearted politics and a shackled military policy, meets a foe who, like the untamed elements, knows no law other than his own power. Any defective action and effort will turn to the advantage of the enemy, and it will not be easy to change from a fencer's position to that of a wrestler. A slight blow may then often be cause enough that a total collapse ensues. All of these reasons explain why action in war is not continuous but spasmodic. Violent clashes are interrupted by periods of observation during which both sides are on the defensive, but usually one side is more strongly motivated, which tends to affect its behavior. The offensive element will dominate and usually maintain its continuity of action. Okay, that was a lot. So, what is he saying here? So, in other words, war is often nothing more than armed neutrality, a threatening attitude meant to support negotiations, or a mild attempt to gain some small advantage, right? So, in movies, like, war is often portrayed as these incredibly climactic, monumentous occasions of decisive action. And what von Clausewitz is saying is that that's not necessarily the case. That may have been the way it was in antiquity, but as he says here, the strategic posture of war is usually going through the motions, winning small battles, or going into what he would consider scientific motions for the one day where they can seize upon a moment, and that moment in itself will be decisive, but not necessarily decisive for the war. So war is kind of boring in the sense that you will not have one or two or even three climactic battles to decide the victor. It will probably be 10 or 15 decisive battles and a lot of, standing around, going into formation, saluting, doing drills, making camp, etc. in the meantime. And it's all very boring, and it seems all kind of just wasted energy. But through these defensive and strategic measures, the tactician, the intelligent mind, makes preparation for when the climactic battles will occur and when they'll occur. And he says that all the reasons explain why action in war is not continuous but spasmodic, right? It's not this long march to war where it's battle after conquest after siege. It's spasmodic, right? It's activity, violence, peace, rest, recuperation, drilling, reformation of troops, and then spasmodic action, violence, war, rest, peace. So it comes as a stutter and not necessarily a long drum. And it is the one side that is more strongly motivated that can endure this spasmodic energy and make it all the way to victory. It's the enemy or the opponent that you have to outlast in this spasmodic and what he calls unorthodox pattern of war, because that is the strategy of defense, is using your time wisely so that when the action comes, you can seize it as victory instead of anticipating victory. So it is the one side more motivated, which tends to affect its behavior, and the offensive element will dominate and usually maintain continuity of action. So the more dug in you are, right, the more enmity you have for your opponent, the more probability you have for success, and your policy should just maintain rather than to look for these great victories immediately. It takes time, and it's often boring. Okay, moving on, we jump to, this is Book 6, Chapter 5, The Character of Strategic Defense. Von Clausewitz said, "Even when the only point of the war is to maintain the status quo, the fact remains that merely parrying a blow goes against the essential nature of war, which certainly does not consist merely in enduring. Once the defender has gained an important advantage, defense as such has done its work. While he is enjoying this advantage, he must strike back, or he will court destruction. Prudence bid him strike while the iron is hot, and use the advantage to prevent a second onslaught. How, when, and where that reaction is to begin depends, of course, on many other conditions which we shall detail subsequently. For the moment, we shall simply say that this transition to the counterattack must be accepted as a tendency inherent in defense, indeed as one of its essential features. Wherever a victory achieved by the defensive form is not turned to military account, where, so to speak, it is allowed to wither away unused, a serious mistake is being made. A sudden, powerful transition to the offensive, the flashing sword of vengeance, is the greatest moment for the defense. If it is not in the commander's mind from the start, or rather if it is not an integral part of his idea of defense, he will never be persuaded of the superiority of the defensive form. All he will see is how much of the enemy's resources he can destroy or capture. But these things do not depend on the way in which the knot is tied, but on the way in which it is untied. Moreover, it is a crude error to equate attack with the ideal of assault alone, and therefore to conceive of defense as merely misery and confusion. Admittedly, an aggressor often decides on war before the innocent defender does, and if he contrives to keep his preparations sufficiently secret, he may well take his victim unawares. Yet such surprise has nothing to do with war itself, and should not be possible. War serves the purpose of the defense more than of the aggressor. It is only aggression that calls forth defense, and war along with it. The aggressor is always peace-loving, as Bonaparte always claimed to be. He would prefer to take over our country unopposed. To prevent his doing so, one must be willing to make war and be prepared for it. In other words, it is the weak, those likely to need defense, who should always be armed in order not to be overwhelmed. Thus decrees the art of war. Badass passage there. Yeah, so the strategic defense of offense as the best defense. The defense as the best offense. I always get that confused. But this is the passage in which the theory of von Clausewitz's philosophy is drawn from. And that the purpose of a defense is not merely to recuperate and to protect yourself, your army, your people from an attack, but it is to look for that moment of counterattack. And that should always be in the commander's mind. That should be in the forefront. It's not how am I going to endure this attack, but rather at what moment am I going to launch a counterattack? And that the purpose of a defense is an offense. The purpose of a defense is your offense. It is not merely to defend. Unless you truly are on the ropes and this is your last stand and all you're doing is hoping to maintain, that's essentially you just delaying the inevitable, which is your destruction, your demise. In that case, I mean, some might argue it's better to sue for peace and have to face that than to simply defend yourself knowing the inevitable loss is on its way. Your defense should always be looking for the opportunity of a counterattack of an offense. And that's what von Clausewitz's philosophy was. And as he said, to prevent Bonaparte, as he kind of says his tongue-in-cheek, that Bonaparte was peace-loving, and that he would prefer that you just give up your country willingly, and that he go in unopposed. Right, he's a peace lover. I just want your country. I don't want to fight you over it. Just hand it over, and we'll be at peace again. So he said to prevent this, the weak must be the ones that are most ready to make defense, and that they must always be armed in order to not be overwhelmed, and that is the art of war. If you are the weaker force, and you know you are, you must look to arm yourself, and you must look to defend yourself, because if a greater force comes along, and they are the aggressor, and they know that they're the stronger force, most likely you will be under attack first. In which case, you must prepare your defenses, but more importantly, prepare for your counterattack if you hope to survive. Merely preparing for defense is preparing for defeat. Your defense must be the preparation of a counterattack offense. Never prepare for defense without a preparation for an offense immediately thereafter. So said Karl von Clausewitz. All right, let's move on. And we move to The People in Arms, page 184, chapter 26. And this is a good one. This one is, very enlightening. The People in Arms, von Clausewitz wrote, "In the civilized parts of Europe, war by means of popular uprisings is a phenomenon of the 19th century. It has its advocates and its opponents. The latter object to it either on political grounds, considering it as a means of revolution, a state of legalized anarchy that is as much of a threat to the social order at home as it is to the enemy, or else on military grounds, because they feel that the results are not commensurate with the energies that have been expended. The first objection does not concern us at all. Here we consider a general insurrection as simply another means of war, in its relation, therefore, to the enemy. The second objection, on the other hand, leads us to remark that a popular uprising should, in general, be considered as an outgrowth of the way in which the conventional barriers have been swept away in our lifetime by the elemental violence of war. It is, in fact, a broadening and intensification of the fermentation process known as war. The system of requisitioning and the enormous growth of armies resulting from it, and from universal conscription, the employment of militia, all of these run in the same direction when viewed from the standpoint of the older, narrower military system, and that also leads to the calling out of the home guard and arming the people. The innovations first mentioned were the natural, inevitable consequences of the breaking down of barriers. They added so immensely to the strength of the side that first employed them that the opponent was carried along and had to follow suit. That will also hold true of the people's war. Any nation that uses it intelligently will, as a rule, gain some superiority over those who disdain its use. If this is so, the question only remains whether mankind at large will gain by this further expansion of the element of war, a question to which the answer should be the same as to the question of war itself. We shall leave both to the philosophers, but it can be argued that the resources expended in an insurrection might be put to better use in other kinds of warfare. No lengthy investigation is needed, however, to uncover the fact that these resources are, for the most part, not otherwise available and cannot be disposed of at will. Indeed, a significant part of them, the psychological element, is called into being only by this type of usage. When a whole nation renders armed resistance, the question then is no longer of what value is this to the people, but what is its potential value, what are the conditions that it requires, and how is it to be utilized. By its very nature, such scattered resistance will not lend itself to major actions, closely compressed in time and space. Its effect is like that of the process of evaporation. It depends on how much surface is exposed. The greater the surface and the area of contact between it and the enemy forces, the thinner the latter have to be spread, the greater the effect of a general uprising. Like smoldering embers, it consumes the basic foundation of the enemy's forces. Since it needs time to be effective, a state of tension will develop while the two elements interact. This tension will either gradually relax if the insurgency is suppressed in some places and slowly burns itself out in others, or else it will build up to a crisis. A great conflagration closes in on the enemy, driving him out of the country before he is faced with total destruction. For an uprising by itself to produce such a crisis presupposes an occupied area of a size that in Europe does not exist outside Russia, or a disproportionate between the invading army and the size of the country that would never occur in practice. To be realistic, one must therefore think of a general insurrection within the framework of a war conducted by the regular army and coordinated in one all-encompassing plan. The following are the only conditions under which a general uprising can be effective. 1. The war must be fought in the interior of the country. 2. It must not be decided by a single stroke. 3. The theater of operations must be fairly large. 4. The national character must be suited to that type of war. And 5. The country must be rough and inaccessible because of mountains, forests, marshes, or other methods of cultivation. Okay. Whew, got through that one. So this is pretty revolutionary thinking for von Clausewitz's day and age, and that is using a homegrown insurrection, the people's revolution in the country itself as a means of, as a force multiplier. So he's not necessarily speaking in terms of one's own domestic peasantry or domestic citizenry rising up against its own country, its own military, its own government, which is what happened in the French Revolutionary Wars. We saw the French Revolution, that case is what exactly happened, but rather using the uprising of the irregular army, which would be the militias, the armed citizenry, against an invading force, while your regular organized military fights on a different front. And he says this can be a very good use, but you have 5 conditions in which it must occur. Number 1, the war must be fought in the interior of the country, which means that the opposing force cannot utilize its navy. It's merely strictly restricted, that's good, is restricted only to its ground troops. where it cannot use naval blockades or things of that kind. It must not be decided by a single stroke. Right, so you're talking about guerrilla warfare. It has to be spasmodic, as he was saying in the previous section. The theater of operations must be fairly large. Okay. Right, so you want your guerrilla forces, your militias spread out. You don't want them packed into a condensed fighting area where a superior force can just come in and crush them. You want the smaller militias, the guerrilla forces, to come in and take little stabs, little pokes, such as a mosquito would. You want a whole army of mosquitoes attacking one large body versus those army of mosquitoes in the I guess in the space of someone's hand, right? An army of mosquitoes can attack me and survive and do a lot of damage against me if they go all over. But if they ball up and attack me in one condensed form, I can just swat them with my hand. So too it must be with guerrilla warfare. The national character must be suited for that type of war. Right, so you have to have a tough, gritty, ornery, redneck type of people to fight that kind of war. Country folk, right? You're not going to find guerrilla armies in the cities, right? You're not going to amass a bunch of hipsters in the Lower East Side of Manhattan into a guerrilla fighting force. Not readily anyway. It would take years to whip those guys into shape. But if you go about 100 miles outside of New York City, west into the country of New York State, you could probably find 50 to 100 good old boys who you could turn into a militia like that. The people have to be suited for that type of warfare. A shotgun, a rifle, and a four-wheel drive, like Hank Williams Jr. said. And the country must be rough and inaccessible, right? Like I said, the peasantry, they live in rough, inaccessible areas. There's rivers, there's streams, there's mountains, there's dirt roads, there's barbed wire fences. A country boy can't survive. That's where you get your peasantry, your militias, is in those hard to reach areas that an organized regular army would have difficulty maneuvering because they're such a large force. So yeah, guerrilla warfare. This was von Clausewitz saying that people who disdain this type of warfare better learn to adapt it, because in his time, the French Revolutionary Wars, the American War, the American Revolution, right? Does that sound familiar? It must be fought in the interior of the country, okay, the American Revolution. It must not be decided by a single stroke. It wasn't. Operations must be fairly large, 13 colonies. National character must be suited to that type of war. A bunch of colonial rednecks were, not going to take the imperial way of doing business anymore. And the country must be rough and inaccessible. It was a loosely affiliated group of colonies. There were no major roads. The infrastructure was very little. So it was very difficult for a professional army to navigate this when a group of colonists were dug in and they wanted freedom, and they had a lot of enmity for their opponent. Okay, yeah, the people in arms. Let's move on to the next section, the object of strategic attack. This is Book 7, Chapter 3, page 196. Von Clausewitz said, "In war, the subjugation of the enemy is the end, and the destruction of his fighting forces the means. That applies to attack and defense alike. By means of the destruction of the enemy's forces, defense leads to attack, which in turn leads to the conquest of the country. That then is the objective, but it need not be the whole country. It may be limited to a part, a province, a strip of territory, a fortress, and so forth. Any one of these may be of political value in negotiations, whether they are retained or exchanged. The object of strategic attack, therefore, may be thought of in numerous gradations, from the conquest of a whole country to that of an insignificant hamlet. As soon as the objective has been attained, the attack ends and defense takes over. One might therefore think of a strategic attack as an entity with well-defined limits, but practice, seeing things, that is, in the light of actual events, does not bear this out. In practice, the stages of the offensive, that is, the intentions and the actions taken, as often turn into defensive action as defensive plans grow into the offensive. It is rare, or at any rate uncommon, for a general to set out with a firm objective in mind. Rather, he will make it dependent on the course of events. Frequently, his attack may lead him further than he expected. After a more or less brief period of rest, he often acquires new strength. but this should not be considered as a second wholly separate action. At other times, he may be stopped earlier than he anticipated, but without abandoning his plan and moving over to a genuine defensive. So it becomes clear that if a successful defense can be imperceptibly turned into attack, the same can happen in reverse. These gradations must be kept in mind if we wish to avoid a misapplication of our general statements on the subject of attack. Right. So this passage dovetails into his strategic defense passage, right? And this is where von Clausewitz is saying the best offense is a good defense. So the subject and the purpose of the attack is to move forward into your enemy's territory or towards their forces or to some other objective for the purposes of destroying it or seizing it for your own use, and thereby taking it as your own and then defending it from being retaken by your opponent, right? So you defend, but your only purpose of your defense is so that you can later go on attack. Similarly, the only reason you would attack is so that you can attain something that is later worth defending. If it's not worth taking, don't bother taking it. If it's not worth defending, don't bother defending it. So your objective should always be look to take something via attack and look to defend that in the future. And if you can defend it, look for a counterattack where you can later take something of equal or greater value. And that will move you closer to your objective, which the strategy should be the overthrow of your enemy. Simple enough. Although he said it a lot better than I did. Let's move to the last passage of this last segment of Karl von Clausewitz's On War. And we conclude here, Book 8, War is an Instrument of Policy, page 252. Von Clausewitz said, "Up to now, we have considered the incompatibility between war and every other human interest, individual or social, a difference that derives from human nature, and that therefore no philosophy can resolve. We have examined this incompatibility from various angles, so that none of its conflicting elements should be missed. Now we must seek out the unity into which these contradictory elements combine in real life, which they do by partly neutralizing one another. We might have positioned that unity to begin with, if it had not been necessary to emphasize the contradictions with all possible clarity and to consider the different elements separately. This unity lies in the concept that war is only a branch of political activity, that it in no sense autonomous. It is, of course, well known that the only source of war is politics, the intercourse of governments and peoples, but it is apt to be assumed that war suspends that intercourse and replaces it by a wholly different condition, ruled by no law than its own. If that is so, then war cannot be divorced from political life, and whenever this occurs in our thinking about war, the many links that connect the two elements are destroyed, and we are left with something pointless and devoid of sense. This conception would be ineluctable even if war were total war and pure elements of enmity unleashed. But it is yet more vital to bear all this in mind when studying actual practice. We will then find that war does not advance relentlessly toward the absolute as theory would demand. Being incomplete and self-contradictory, it cannot follow its own laws, but has to be treated as a part of some other whole, the name of which is policy. In making use of war, policy evades all rigorous conclusions proceeding from the nature of war, bothers little about ultimate possibilities, and concerns itself only with immediate probabilities. Although this introduces a high degree of uncertainty into the whole business, turning it into a kind of game. Each government is confident that it can outdo its opponent in skill and acumen. So policy converts the overwhelmingly destructive element of war into a mere instrument. It changes the terrible battle sword that a man needs both hands and his entire strength to wield, and with which he strikes home once and no more, into a light, handy rapier, sometimes just a foil for the exchange of thrusts, feints, and parries. Thus the contradictions in which war involves that naturally timid creature, man, are resolved, if this is the solution we choose to accept. If war is part of policy, policy will determine its character. As policy becomes more ambitious and vigorous, so will war, and this may reach the point where war attains its absolute form. If we look at war in this light, we do not need to lose sight of this absolute. On the contrary, we must constantly bear it in mind. Only if war is looked at in this way does its unity reappear. Only then can we see that all wars are things of the same nature, and this alone will provide the right criteria for conceiving and judging great designs. Yeah, so that's pretty deep. And it's very prescient for what's going on right now in the United States. So as I was reading these passages for the fourth part on war, I couldn't help but look back and kind of take in everything that's happened with the war in Afghanistan. Almost 20 years. I think just about 20 years. And, you know, I was also thinking back to the passage, the famous passage by Sun Tzu. No country in the history of mankind has ever profited from prolonged or indistinct warfare, indistinct for its purpose, right? So no country has ever profited long-term from perpetual war. What is your objective? War is our objective. If that is your objective, you are going to suffer and suffer greatly the longer it goes on. And a lot of people have been asking this question about America with Afghanistan. Like, what was it all for, right? If the evacuation, the hasty evacuation, as messy and absurd as it was, is the end result, what was our objective? Well, as he says here, I'll read, almost fell over. In making use of war, policy evades all rigorous conclusions proceeding from the nature of war, bothers little about ultimate possibilities, and concerns itself only with immediate probabilities. Although this introduces a high degree of uncertainty into the whole business, turning it into a kind of game, each government is confident that it can outdo its opponent in skill and acumen. Right, so what was the point of the Afghanistan war? Nobody knows. It all looks like folly. It all looks like a complete bumbling series of errors, wasted blood and treasure. And it could very well have been wasted blood and treasure for the most part. But you have to admit, all wars follow some design because there are people in charge. If the war is being waged by an incompetent, that will show itself immediately. If the end of a war is shown to be led by an incompetent, that could simply be just a matter of the last phase of that overall war, that overall conflict, but not necessarily indicative of the war as a whole. And I think most people would say the ending of that war was about as incompetent as it gets. But it cannot be without design. Why was the conclusion of the war in Afghanistan so incompetent to the point where people thought it's incompetent beyond the realm of stupidity, right? It's like, and I use this analogy, right? Someone could be late for work. You could believe that. But if someone's late for work and they forgot to put on their shoes and they wreck their car, that's almost to the point of you would have to be so incompetent and so stupid that those series of errors all occurring in the same period of time are impossible. I believe you probably were late. Maybe you forgot to put on your shoes. But I don't believe you were late, forgot to put on your shoes, and wrecked your car all in the same period, and that's just a matter of, complete boobery. I think the same is true for the war in Afghanistan, that there has to be design as to why it ended so sloppily. And it's like Soren Kierkegaard said, life is a difficult thing in that it can only be understood in reverse, but it must be lived moving forward. And that's where we are. I don't believe the war in Afghanistan is over by a long shot. I think the ramifications of how that war was left will haunt America for years to come. But I think later, as time moves on and we progress in life forward, we will understand more clearly in reverse why the war was waged and why it was ended so seemingly bad as it was. Because I believe there are people who wanted it to end that way. And I think von Clausewitz would say, yeah, there was probably a reason and a design behind why it ended as it did. But I guess that will be for future posterity to figure out. Okay, that'll conclude my little political rant at the end there, but I felt that it was very ironic that I was covering On War, coming to the last part of this series, and boom, the conclusion of the war in Afghanistan happens right smack dab in the middle of this series. And I'm watching it, on the news, reading articles, and I'm trying to parse the pieces together. Like, why do this? Why would we leave over 100,000 weapons and Black Hawk helicopters, and we left I think 2 or 3 dozen APCs, double the amount of Humvees. We left everything. We abandoned Bagram Air Force Base and we moved to Kabul Airport to do the evacuation there, which seems backwards. Why wouldn't you tell everyone to abandon Kabul Airport and move to Bagram, which is what you control? You already have operations set up there. You can defend that with your own personnel. Why abandon that? It seems ridiculous. And it could all very well be. But like I said, some of these accidents occur as a matter of just stupidity, but some of these accidents can't occur in such a finite window by so many different levels of rank and hierarchy to not be part of a design. And I think, that design will probably become more clear as time goes by. Anyway, I appreciate y'all hanging around for the entire series, or at least part 4 if this is the only one you watched. Give it a thumbs up if you liked it. I think I might cover the Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli next. Yeah, I was going through the library and I saw the Prince right there, and I think it'll be a good companion piece to follow up On War by von Clausewitz. So I think we'll go into that, and we'll go into some more perhaps philosophical readings on how a sovereign or a prince should maintain and exercise his power. But we'll pick up there for next time. Till then, and as always, have a good Labor Day, and we'll see you next time.